So, welcome everybody. My name is Jo Mynard, and I'm the Managing Director and founder of Candlin Mynard. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the book launch this evening in my time. I'm based in Japan, and we're delighted to celebrate the launch of our fabulous book. And we've got the authors here, Christian Jones and Graham Burton, waiting patiently for me to finish the introductions. But if I can ask just to give me a few minutes so I can tell you a little bit about Candlin and Mynard. So this is what we'll do tonight. So I'll just say a few words and then we'll have Chris and Graham share some insights from the book. And then we'll have a Q&A, and then there's a prize draw, which is of course very exciting. Okay, so Candlin and Mynard was founded in 2012. And as you can see from our top bio, I suppose, we facilitate links between research, practice and publication. That's exactly what we do. And we founded it was myself and Christopher Candlin. We founded it as a way initially to support our colleagues. We weren't very happy with some of the publishers we dealt with back then. And we wanted a way for people to, to publish their research and get support, feel supported while they did so. And so now we have several series. We've had lots of books. We've been going for many years. So I just want to introduce you to some of our series and series editors. So Tim Murphy heads up the Positive Pedagogical Praxis series. Now, the book we're going to hear about tonight is part of this series. So it looks at theoretical and practical approaches to learning and transforming classroom experiences. So we've got several books in this series and another one or two coming out later this year. Anna Maria Pinter heads up the Teaching English to Young Learners series. I'm the series editor for the Autonomous Language Learning series. This was our first one, and we explore theoretical and practical and philosophical relationships between learners and the ways in which they autonomously navigate the process. So we've got quite a lot of books in this series, 13 actually, and we've got two more coming up in the coming few months, including one by David Little. So I'm very excited about that. We've also got a Life and Education in Japan series, which is pretty well established as well. So the series editors currently are Melody Cook and Anne Howard, and formerly Diane Hawley Nagatomo. And they've got 8 books in this series, and we've got one more coming up later this year. This really caters for the expatriate community in Japan, or anybody who's really interested in Japan and anything to do with life and education in Japan. These books are really fascinating and so unique. This is our newest series. It's headed up by our series editor, Louise Ohashi. So generative AI and foreign language education. And we've got 2 super exciting books coming out later in the year. So you hear more about that later. And the Leadership in Language Education series with the series editor, Kevin Knight. So we've got a couple more books coming out in this series later this year as well. So we've been busy. So I wanted to give you a taster of some of the other things that we've been doing. So if you're interested in supporting us, and yes, please do support small independent publishers. Please buy our books, ask your libraries to stock them, either ebooks, because we have them on ProQuest, libraries can stock them. If you have a research grant, you remember them. Sometimes you have a budget to be able to support open access publishing. This really helps small independent publishers a lot. Follow us on social media, cite our books if appropriate in your publications, review our books. If you have a journal in mind, please get in touch. I can send you a review copy, and add your books to your class reading lists and publish with us. I'll tell you more about that at the end of the talk today. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to introduce our speakers today. So let me introduce Christian Jones, who's a reader in applied linguistics and TESOL at the University of Liverpool. So he's been involved in English language learning for over 25 years, and he's worked in China, Japan, Thailand, and the UK as a teacher trainer, and researcher. So his main research interests are connected to spoken language, and he's published widely in this area with work related to spoken corpora, lexis, lexicography, and instructed second language acquisition. Graham Burton is an assistant professor at the Free University of Bolzano in Italy. So he's worked in English language teaching and applied linguistics for around 25 years as a teacher trainer, materials author and editor, and a researcher. So he's taught in Italy, the UK, and Greece, and his main research interests are applications of corpus linguistics to language teaching, materials development, pedagogic grammar, academic writing, and multilingualism. So as you can tell, we're in very good hands with this book. And I don't know if you've had the chance to read about the book at all, but we look at how grammar topics that seem to dominate language teaching, how so these familiar structures, conditionals, reported speech, and so on, drawing on an actual corpus of conversation data. They've looked at how these structures actually function in real life conversations. So that gives the rest of us insights into what we should be teaching and how we should be teaching it. So it's aimed at teachers, researchers, and curriculum designers. It covers all the important grammar topics, I think. I really like what Scott Thornbury said about it. He said, this is a book that I've been hoping for a very long time now that someone else would write. Exactly, my thoughts exactly. Somebody has taken the time to do the work so that we can all benefit as educators. So please welcome our speakers tonight then, Christian and Graham, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jo. Thanks for the introduction. And we'd just like to say at this point also thanks to Scott Thornbury for endorsing the book. Thanks also to Ivor Timmis for doing the same. And also thanks to Geraldine Mark for writing the foreword for the book. And thanks to you all for taking the time to come today. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit of briefly the rationale and the theory behind the book. And also the approach that we took in the book to analysing the data. Then we're going to focus just on one example from one chapter. So we're going to look at some of the findings and implications from the chapter on will and going to, because it's illustrative of lots of the other chapters in the book in terms of the approach. So we thought it was an interesting chapter just to discuss. Then at the end, there will be a Q&A. And after that, as Jo said, there's a prize draw. If as we're going along, you think of questions, by all means, put them in the chat, but we'll deal with all the questions at the end. Okay. So we felt it's important in a book about grammar to really start off by saying, what do we mean by grammar? Sounds like a strange question, but strangely also, lots of grammar books don't actually explain what they mean by grammar. So although we could of course write probably a book on this question or a series on this question, don't worry, we're not going to do that. We thought it was good to define it. So we talk about this a little bit in the first chapter and expand on what we're saying here. So this is just a kind of summarized version. So what do we mean by grammar? Well, one aspect of grammar is, of course, it's the internal structures of words and phrases and the manner in which they're arranged into sentences, but also in turns, spoken turns, and utterances, things that people say. So this is the kind of classic definition of morphology and syntax. Okay, so that's one aspect. But we also see grammar as a system for making meaning. It's something that people use to make meanings, and the rules are established through use, of course. At the same time, for us, grammar is, of course, form, but it's also function, and we can't really separate, we don't think, those two aspects meaningfully. We can't talk about form without talking about function. You can't talk about function without talking about form. So that's a big part of the book. And of course, we make, and there is often a distinction between spoken and written forms. And sometimes that distinction is very, very clear, sometimes not so clear. Sometimes written forms are used as a kind of model for spoken language, which we would certainly question. And as I said, sometimes there are distinct differences, which we try to draw upon in this book. Obviously, the focus in the book is on the uses of these grammatical forms in conversational language. But obviously then sometimes by implication there is a contrast to how they're used in writing. And the final kind of aspect of this summary is that grammar is also lexicogrammar, so it's very difficult to separate meaningfully lexis from grammar. They often are kind of interlinked. And, you know, one of the kind of classic examples of this is from Halliday, who talks about an expression like take pride in. So we have the kind of idiom take pride in, but very often that's followed by the ing form. So it's an example where you've got a kind of what we might think of as a piece of lexis, but also very strongly linked often to a particular grammatical form. So those are the sort of aspects in summary of what we mean by grammar. Okay. What then are the big beasts? Okay, these are, as Jo's briefly mentioned, these are kind of areas of grammar which take up a lot of what you might call bandwidth in terms of teachers' thinking, in terms of classroom use, in terms of perhaps even learners' thinking. And they take up a lot of bandwidth in syllabuses, of course, in textbooks, in self-access materials, in exams and exam preparation. And as I said, maybe also in teachers' minds and in learners' minds as well. And we can all think probably of examples of these areas, such as conditionals, comparatives, superlatives, relative clauses. We could go on. They're these kind of areas which occupy a lot of bandwidth. And we're not suggesting that, or rather, our interest is not whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's that's just a reality that is. But we do think it's a good thing to understand more about some of these big beasts. We should also say that we wouldn't take any credit for this particular term. We've adapted it from Ivor Timmis, who we give the reference for this at the end, who used it in a slightly more negative way than we do, but he used it to kind of talk about these areas. So we've kind of borrowed it and taken it on board for the book. So thanks again for that, Ivor. Why explore then some of these areas in conversations? Well, as I said, teachers, learners need or want to look at some of these areas in classes. Many descriptions and activities in textbooks, for example, are based on written form. So the written form is quite often used as a kind of model for spoken use, which seems a bit strange to us. And we felt that needs addressing. Many learners will express an aim and desire to achieve some kind of spoken competence in their second language, in English as a second language or foreign language. So in order for them to get that, we need a good description of how certain forms, how some of these big beasts are actually used in conversations. Also then, although there's been a lot of research on spoken grammar, we felt that it's had relatively limited influence on descriptions, on descriptive grammar, and maybe there are some missing elements in some existing grammatical descriptions. This book is not a reference grammar. We're not covering everything. We will mention some of the other areas we talk about in the book at the end. But we felt maybe there are some missing elements in some of these areas that we look at. Okay. So our influence and our kind of underpinnings in the book we were interested in the idea of communicative competence, which was first coined by Himes back in 1972. And really that just says that we cannot know a form without knowing how it functions in context. So again, that's the idea of form and function being kind of inseparable, really. So we were influenced by that idea. We were also influenced by Halliday and systemic functional grammar, systemic functional linguistics, sometimes called. and particularly his idea of ideational, textual, and interpersonal metafunctions. So the idea of language being used to maintain, establish relationships, to link ideas together across turns, in this case, because we're looking at conversations, and the way that language is, of course, used to express concepts, ideas, opinions, views of the world, and how those metafunctions often interlink. Obviously, because we look at a corpus, we're interested in empirical data over intuition, and we're looking at naturally occurring data because we think then you can make discoveries about both form or forms and function or functions. So in this sense, we kind of were influenced by Sinclair's idea of trusting the text. So trusting what the data tells you about the language when you look at it in a corpus. Okay, so that's the kind of theoretical background and the underpinning. Graham's going to go on to talk about our approach and start by talking about some of the data from this example of going to and will. Okay, so over to Graham.
All right, thanks, Chris. I just say quickly, unfortunately, I don't have control of the slides here, Chris does, so he'll just try and click through as I'm talking, and hopefully everything will sync up. So our approach was we used the Spoken BNC 2014. So this is, let's say, the new version of the British National Corpus. So far, only the spoken part is available, which is 11 million words, solely conversation. So that was really important for us because, as Chris mentioned, we're interested in this conversational context. So these are recordings. They were from between 2012 and 2016, I think, all in informal contexts, but there's no monologues or anything like that. So this is perhaps the kind of archetypal use of language almost, really. It's people talking to one another in an informal context. So we're seeing how language works in that, exactly in that context. And, that's important to underline. I think that we didn't make any observations, obviously, about written language, anything else like that. We're just purely exploring how grammar seems to work in conversation. So we had this kind of multi-stage approach, which you can see in the book when you look through the chapters. So we started each chapter, well, actually, the first thing really is we reviewed what is the consensus view of this area of grammar. Then we gave some basic frequency information. So just raw frequency, perhaps if we're, for example, with will and going to, we'll see some examples with this. Just to get an overview, the overall frequency of will compared to going to and things like that. And then we had this next stage, which became, I think, really important for us throughout the book, which is, we called it a deep dive into the data. So we typically generated something like 200 concordance lines for whatever we were looking at, and then just went to them kind of with an open mind, just to try and take this kind of bottom-up approach, just to see what we found from the data without going in with too many preconceived ideas about how a particular area of grammar works. And I think we found that there was always at least one thing that surprised us when we did this, at least one thing, and it might be syntactic, could be something functional. So I think, in this deep dive, we'll see this in a later slide, but it became something I think really important in the book. We always found in the deep dive what had already been described, but I think there was often something extra that we found. And so we found it was a really kind of powerful approach for us. Then after that, we typically turned to looking at n-grams, and this was something that we always found useful for investigating forms and functions, so for kind of showing patterns. So n-grams here, we were looking at particular 3-word, 4-word, sometimes 5-word chunks containing a particular grammar structure that we were looking at. And then finally, for each grammar point, and so therefore for each chapter, we had conclusions and implications for teaching, and we tried to always list some key takeaways. So kind of the main points really for each chapter. So, as Chris said, what we're going to look at here is just looking at will and going to, which is one of the chapters. So a focus just on this, and in fact, I mean, obviously we can't talk about the whole book. We can't even talk about a whole chapter. So we'll just take a few kind of key ideas from this. So starting with the conventional view of will and going to, if you change the slide, there we are. So this is the conventional view, typically more or less in English language teaching. So when we looked at the conventional view for each grammar point, we were tending to look at how it's taught in as part of pedagogical grammar, but not exclusively. So this is typically how will is described, normally described for spontaneous decisions made at the time of speaking. So the classic, if you're in a restaurant and you say, yeah, I'll have the pasta or something like that. And then these other more kind of modal uses, so the use of will for making predictions, for promises, for expressing volition. Going to, on the other hand, is typically described as being used for future plans, future intentions, and these often contrasted with will, because the idea is that we use going to when we've already decided something. And another area, predictions with present evidence. And again, the classic example, for people who've been involved in English language teaching, is always the look at the clouds, it's going to rain. So the idea that you make a prediction, but it's based on some kind of evidence, typically that you can see in some way. As kind of subtypes of these two structures, well, we've also got was and were going to. So sometimes called the future and the past, sometimes describe something along these lines, changed intention. So you intended to do one thing and then turned out you didn't. And then finally, the future progressive. So after will and going to, obviously we can have the progressive aspect. And it's typically there described as something that's in progress at a specific future time. So what did we find? As I said, the first thing we looked at always was the basic kind of raw frequency data. And there's a few things to say here. And obviously you've got a load of information here. What do we notice? Firstly, we can see overall that will is more frequent in this conversational corpus than going to, but not a whole lot more frequent. They're obviously both very frequent. If you look at just will there, the second form, the contracted form, is by far the most frequent. So over 3 times as many examples of ul than there are of will. And that's interesting if you think as well that obviously we don't use that contracted form in question forms. So that really shows how much more common it is. And then equally with going to and gonna, I mean, here obviously we have to trust the transcriptions, but I think they did pay a lot of attention to this when this spoken data was transcribed, that they did transcribe it very carefully. And so we can see this gonna form being far more frequent than the full form going to. Just looking right down at the bottom of the table there, you can see that the future progressive form with will and with going to is really relatively infrequent, as is, to be honest, the was, were going to or was, were gonna. So these are certainly more marginal forms overall. Like I said, next step for us was always this deep dive. So in this case, what we did was generate 200 concordant lines for will and 200 for going to. And the first thing we tried to do was to look for each one and say, well, does it actually have a future time reference? That was the first thing to establish. And then we tried to look one by one and see, well, what is the actual function here? And as I said before, kind of trying to come at that with an open mind. So starting with will, and then Chris will take over and talk about going to. Of those 200 lines, we had 141 that clearly referred to a future time period. And of these, we noticed that it was prediction, which was the most common function. And one of the things we saw here was that how often you get other forms of modality co-occurring somewhere nearby will or ul. So in the first example here, we've got hopefully. So hopefully they'll stop hassling you. And then the second one, you've got 2 forms of a modality. Basically, you've got the adverb, but then also the verb there. So certainly think. And so we found that very, very common, that you don't just get the will by itself to indicate prediction. There is some kind of other modality there to indicate that it's a prediction. However, conversely, we find sometimes that there is no modality, and it seems to change the flavor a little bit of what's going on. So in this example, it's someone, I don't remember exactly what it was about. Yeah, talking about wood and water. And so you get this, it'll mark, wood will stain, whereas this won't stain. And so what we noticed here is it almost seems to be like a marked form. So I'm talking about marking wood, but linguistically marked, to not have any modality with the will. So here it's presented as a fact. I mean, it's clearly not a fact, because if you're talking about the future, you can't really talk about facts in the future because it hasn't happened yet. So it still is a prediction, but it's this prediction presented as a fact. It wasn't generally like this. Generally, we did find the other modality, but we did find other modality nearby. But when you don't do it, it does seem to create this, it seems to be, very on purpose, essentially, on the part of the speaker, that they are trying to present something as a fact, even when it is still essentially a prediction. Some other functions that we saw, intention, but not always at the time of speaking. So this kind of goes against the conventional view a little bit, which says that you would use going to in this case. So for example, here, I'll do a qualification, then I'll travel for a year. I'll be there for probably about a year and a half. So possibly the last one you might say is more like a prediction, and you have got the modality there, the probably. But those first two forms were slightly a surprise, because typically the description says that we would use going to for this, when it seems to be an intention, not at the moment of speaking, not like when you're in the restaurant ordering something, but something you decided a while before. Another very common function was promises. One thing we noticed here is that promise doesn't have to be something that you're promising about yourself. It could be something else. So here we've got, she'll tell you how much it is. So talking about someone else, so promising that someone else will do a certain action, which we don't normally see described as a function. We also found a lot of examples of reported speech, reported thought, or it's often imagined. So these two examples here, I could say, and then you've got this kind of embedded clause, no, I don't want any financial help, I'll do it myself. Or I ought to let, and then we have this anonymized name, to let this person know that you will actually go. So we found will a lot in that context. And then finally, we saw it as volition, and it's often habitual. I don't remember what they were talking about here, some kind of device, some kind of machine. The forward position rotate won't work. Okay, so back to Chris now, who's going to go through some of the basic data about going to.
Thanks very much, Graham. Okay, so same chapter, we did a similar thing for going to. When we looked at the kind of deep dive here, slightly fewer of these were obviously referring to or clearly referring to the future. So 89 out of 200. And when we looked at these similarly to will or ul, prediction was the most common function that seemed to be in evidence from these initial 200 examples. And here's an example, do help yourself. There's going to be a lot of etc. As well as kind of predictions that I might make, there was also often predictions about others' typical or habitual behavior. So here is an example of that. Every time you message her, she's going to go, oh God, yeah. So somebody's predicting, but they're talking about someone else's kind of expected typical behavior. So that was a difference from the kind of standard way predictions are described. Other functions, there were examples of either intentions, as mentioned, as being a common way, that a standard way that this is talked about, and also changed intentions, so-called future and the past. So here we've got one example of each. The first one is this classic asking about intentions. You're going to go to Nepal, whereabouts? What's your intention? And the second one, of course, is a changed intention. She was going to go into nursing. I don't know if she ever did or not. So there were examples of those. And in a similar way to will, this was common. There was, of course, reporting occurring within speech reports, often signaled by like. So here we have one. I had to do that mean, and I was like, I can't do it. And then he was like, right, we're going to do press ups now. And I was like, no, I can't do it. And he was like, right, you got to do 10 now. And I was like, no. So it's just reporting directly what somebody said and going to features in those reports. In the chapter on reported speech, of course, we describe this kind of use of like, for example, and the direct reporting in a lot more detail. Very, very common. Okay. In terms of the n-grams, these are just some examples of the 2 and 3 word n-grams that were produced. These were 2 or 3 word expressions containing gonna and ul, which we searched for. And this is really just to give us an indication of the kind of lexicogrammar, the common patterns which these were used for. So first of all, we looked for just frequency, and then we explored them in context to look at how they're functioning. So some things we noticed from this kind of initial data were first, obviously you can see the shorter 2 word expressions are in general more frequent with gonna and also with will. We also noticed that will being followed by be and gonna being followed by be, in both cases, that was the most common pattern in the 2 word expressions, so will be and gonna be. We also noticed, particularly with will, as Graham kind of mentioned briefly about this co-occurrence of other kind of modal expressions almost. So there was a lot of use of adverbs with particularly will. So we've got I'll just and I'll probably there. The other thing we noticed in the longer 3 word n-grams were this kind of almost double modality, really. So we've got will plus have to as being the most frequent 3 word expression, and also gonna have to, the same, almost the same pattern. So when we looked into the data a bit more in context, we were interested in some of these patterns and how they occurred, and also how they functioned in context. So in the next bit, I'm going to just show you a few examples from the kind of longer stretches of data that we looked at when we looked at these in context. Okay, I mentioned before that gonna be was highly frequent. You can see it as the most frequent 2 word expression. When we looked into gonna be in a bit more detail, we found that able was the most common adjective following gonna be, and we found lots of examples of that. In this example here in context, we can see again the function of prediction, and in this case it's based on present evidence. So there's 2 mothers here with toddlers, and they might be younger than toddlers, but anyway, very young children, and they're talking about that, and they're making predictions on that, and they're actually talking about the recording they're doing. So one of them says, we're not going to be able to do this recording once she starts speaking. So I guess that's the toddler. And then the other person, the conversation partner, says, no, it will really interrupt things, won't it? This example also shows something that we saw quite often in when we started looking at the language in context. Very often, when one person makes a prediction with, in this case, going to, the other speaker follows it with a kind of synonym very often. So we're not going to be able to do this based on present evidence. They can see the child is about to start talking, and then the speaker follows that or agrees with that, but with a synonym. That's maybe a kind of very common discourse pattern, which you might see across lots of different language forms, but we certainly also noticed that here. So this was a prediction with able, going to be able to, based on present evidence. Something else we saw when we looked at this pattern was also that people made predictions, again, but not actually based on any present evidence. They were based much more on a kind of assumed shared knowledge between the speakers. So we're making that prediction and we're assuming that the other people will probably agree with us based on what they know about what we're talking about. So here is a person talking about an older relative, and they're talking about their grandmother. What did you do at Granny's? Just the usual stuff. They start talking about that. They start talking about hearing aids. And then one says, yes, she's not going to be able to alter the switch if she needs something as simple as possible. A clear prediction. There's no present evidence. The grandmother isn't in the conversation. There's no hearing aid there. But the prediction is still made nonetheless, and it's based on an assumed shared knowledge between the speakers. So very much a kind of interpersonal function of the language, used to, again, I don't need to make it clear, any clearer about this prediction. I would assume that you know this, and I would assume you share that knowledge. Okay. We also mentioned, going back, will be as being very common. And when we looked into this more, we obviously found lots of adjectives following the be here in this pattern. And one use of this that we found frequently was this kind of use. So the person here is speaking about a trip, and they're talking about getting a boat in Ullswater. So a boat down Ullswater sounds lovely. Oh, the steamer down, and I'll have a little walk and get some hot chocolate. Yeah, that'll be nice. So there's two things happening here. One, this is a sort of, on one level, of course it's a prediction. I think it will be nice. But at the same time, it's being used to show listenership, to show interest in what the other person's saying. It's a kind of supportive move in the conversation. So again, it has a very interpersonal function. It's encouraging the person to continue. It's showing interest in what they're saying, etc. And we found lots of examples of this with this pattern. With will have to, again, we found examples of this in use where it's on one level, it's a prediction. So here's an example. They're talking about having to open something. Thank you very much. And you have to open it because it's got you're doing well. I think they're talking about a bottle of wine. So that's on one level, it's being used like that. On another level, it's kind of being used almost as an advising function. So it's a prediction, but it's sort of saying this is something that I think it is important that we do. So here they're talking about somebody visiting. They visited us on, what was it, the 27th? Yeah. We came back here on the 27th, came back on the 27th. We'll have to check when my nana's having a party, literally leaving in the middle of the party. So it's on one sense it's a prediction, but at the same time it's almost kind of advising here. Okay, so those are just a kind of flavor of some of the different functions we found when we looked in context. And as I said, we started here by looking at the the lexico-grammatical patterns, and then we looked at them in context to look at the functions. Okay, over to Graham for the conclusions.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So, overall conclusions, for this chapter, really, as we've been saying, this prediction function was absolutely the most common for both forms. But as we've also seen, there's prediction and there's prediction in ELT materials, but also, to be honest, kind of more general descriptive grammars, there is often this focus on really prototypical predictions. So it's the things like, it's going to rain, look at the clouds, or predictions about the future, in 100 years' time. But as you can see, when you look at this conversational data, it's the predictions are often quite different. They work in a different way. They have a far more interpersonal aspect to them. And that seems to really come out from the data, seems to be very important, exactly what kind of prediction we're talking about. So that's the first thing we noticed. The other thing is looking at these lexicogrammatical patterns. As Chris said, it's kind of a double modality, right? So you've got the kind of the future form and then be able. Interesting just how common that is. And it's also interesting for me to reflect back on almost kind of like previous life for me, where I worked far more in ELT publishing as an editor, as an author. You would deliberately avoid these because it seems to be complicating the picture. So if you were going to do a lesson on going to, perhaps you'd find a nice text and say, oh, well, great, it's got loads of examples of going to, and then you notice half of them are going to be able, and you'd think, oh, no, well, that's no good then, because that's too much. And that might be true, but the problem is then if you bin it definitively, which I think we can see here you shouldn't, that it seems to be worth exposing learners to this maybe after the initial explanation where you've isolated going to with a simpler form like be or have or go or something like that. But at some point it seems worth showing this and showing how it works. And the other thing which we've had a little bit less time to go into, but we kind of mentioned briefly, is the question of the adverb combinations, both with will and with going to. In those n-gram tables that Chris showed before, there were these examples with just. And in the chapter, if you take a look at it, we found some really interesting ways of, we didn't just find adverbs related to predictions. There are all kind of different types of adverbs with really quite subtle interpersonal meanings that come through when you see how they work with the future form. So the final stage here, and as like I said earlier, also for each chapter, we always looked at implications. So for the going to and will forms, we felt it's probably worth highlighting, firstly, just going back to what I said at the beginning with the raw data, the overall frequency of contracted forms, just how important they seem to be, how much more frequent they are than the full forms. We also think it's worth, absolutely, as we've said, focusing on the prediction function and maybe looking at the different kinds of predictions that seem to be made and that interpersonal function as well. And as I said, also looking at the common lexicogrammatical patterns, including with adverbs. Just as a little kind of preview of the rest of the book, here are the other big beasts that we talk about. So we've got a chapter on comparatives and superlatives, one on quantifiers, one on relative clauses, one on modal verbs, not all modal verbs, a kind of little subset of modal verbs. And then, as Chris already mentioned, there's one about reported speech as well. So that pretty much brings us to the end of it. We've got a quick slide showing the references that we showed earlier. And next slide, we have the word questions. So are there any questions or comments or anything else from you?